Okay, I think I'm going to start. So welcome everybody to this BHRC event on shrinking space, the space, civil society space in South Asia. Thank you for joining us, those in the UK who are stopping over your lunch breaks or taking lunch breaks to join us. And thank you. I know that there are participants here from around the world, so thank you very much to all of you for joining us. We are delighted to have an extremely eminent panel join us today. I know I've had comments from a lot of you in private messages to say how delighted you are to see this panel all together. So my heartfelt thanks to our panel today, Hina Jalani, Meenakshi Ganguly, Sarah Hussain and Rajat Khosla, who have joined us from around the world as well today. I will formally introduce them in just a moment. But just to say that the broad order for today's events are going to be, we're going to hear from all of the panelists first for a few minutes each. We're then going to move to a slightly round table format, in as much as you can have that in this Zoom webinar format, where we're going to talk about some of the issues raised by each of the panelists and may interject with some of the questions that are coming up through the Q&A. And then we will open the floor to questions from you, our audience. So please do contribute through the Q&A. If you have questions to ask, please put them in the Q&A. We'll be checking those questions, and we hope to get to as many of those as we can later in the session today. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I still find this very strange after 7 months of doing these kind of panels, not to be able to see and engage with our audience. It's really very strange. So please do engage with us through the Q&A. Thanks ever so much indeed. Just a few words from me before we hear from our panelists. Civil society is under attack in a large number of countries around the world. At BHRC, we have seen this happen in Egypt, in Turkey, in Hungary, and now in Hong Kong. And we see civil society attacked through a variety of means, be they funding restrictions or contribution restrictions, be they reporting or licensing restrictions, or purported to be licensing or reporting restrictions, be they travel restrictions, even be there restrictions about foreigners contributing towards NGOs. But be in no doubt, these sorts of restrictions are largely intended as a tool to silence. Where they are used in this way, they are used to silence and repress independent, critical voices from speaking out and from holding governments accountable around the world. NGOs and civil society remain one of the most effective methods of holding governments to account around the world. And so we've seen, as crises, rule of law crises, as clampdowns on human rights have continued to arise in countries around the world, that civil society finds itself a victim of attack. And sometimes the attacks on civil society, this constant sense of repression and closing down on civil society, doesn't attract the kind of attention that, for example, attacks on journalists or attacks on human rights defenders might gain. They are no less important because each of these institutions form part of the way in which we hold our governments to account. An attack on civil society, in effect, becomes an attack on the rule of law. An example of how we've seen that, and an example of how BHRC has been concerned about that in recent times, has been the Foreign Contributions Regulatory Act in India, which I'm sure Rajat's going to speak about. And what we've seen is that act has been criticised very, very recently by Michelle Bachelet, for example, the Human Rights High Commissioner, saying that it's being used as a method to deter and to punish NGOs for their human rights work and advocacy. We have seen, and we at BHRC have been concerned about these sorts of attacks across South Asia. We've commented on, for example, the use of that act against particular human rights defenders, against particular human rights lawyers, such as Lawyers Collective and the office holders and the office bearers and the lawyers of those institutions. And I know that today all of our panelists will speak about similar restrictions and effect, similar ways in which the closing down of space in their own countries and their region impacts upon the key work of of pursuing human rights and pursuing a human rights agenda, and ensuring those who are most marginalized in our societies, those whose voices need amplification, those whose voices are often repressed either by a majority or by simply not being able to speak out. Civil society is needed for their protection. And so without further ado, I want to introduce you to our panel today. We have to start with Hina Jalani. Hina founded Pakistan's first all-women law firm and legal aid centre, as well as the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan and the campaign group Women's Action Forum. Hina has won landmark cases that set new standards for human rights, whilst advocating for vulnerable groups such as women, children and prisoners. She has also campaigned for the democratization of the political system, and from 2000 to 2008, Hina served as a UN Special Representative on human rights defenders. She also won numerous awards in recognition of her commitment to human rights, the rule of law and democracy in her work as an international human rights lawyer. So without further ado, Hina Jalani.
Thank you, Shona. It's a pleasure to be here with so many friends from South Asia. And I'm sure that within the participant group, there are others who are listening very keenly to what we have to say. I think most of us on the panel today will be telling you the same story. But that is exactly why it is important that these stories be told, because this kind of points to the fact that while governments oppose each other on a political level, they are very fast to copy all the bad trends that one adopts and the other then copies. And it's very, in some ways, amazing that in suppressing their own population, governments will step over each other to do what they can to make sure that they are making less and less space for civil society in particular. You know, in the context of South Asia today, I think it's not just shrinking space for civil society, it's also fading democracy that we need to worry about. Because this is not just a shrinking space, it's almost like the space is disappearing for human rights defenders and the civil society in generally to be able to operate and do the work that they are entitled to do, because it is a right in itself to defend human rights. And at the same time, what we are experiencing today in each of the countries of South Asia, and I'm sure that none of these South Asian countries or governments in these South Asian countries can come up and say that the situation is any different from what we are depicting. First of all, there are legal and regulatory frameworks that have been used again and again to restrict the freedom of association, which means obviously that a lot of the NGOs and human rights, in particular human rights organizations, are finding it more and more difficult to register themselves. There are arbitrary and draconian laws that are deregistering organizations. There are other restrictions on the freedom of association that make it impossible for civil society actors to take collective action, not just on human rights issues, but you know, just collective action at the community level for social and economic needs that people have at, in neighborhoods and communities. So there are the administrative and judicial harassment of human rights defenders who are time and again charged under these draconian laws that restrict the freedom of association, but at the same time, the harassment is not limited to laws on restricting the freedom of association. New layers of restrictions are being put in place by governments to limit the ability of non-government organizations to work or even to receive their funding. Across the region, draconian laws, such as those on sedition, internal security, have been used against civil society targeting everyone from human rights defenders and journalists to bloggers and even local community activists. Then laws on public order, morality, national security or emergency, or regulations on forming associations or receiving foreign funding are now being frequently used to deprive these human rights communities of their liberty, their freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and even freedom to carry on their own professions. I know, and I think everyone here will be able to give examples, for instance, of sanctions against many lawyers working for the defense of human rights who have been imposed with such kind of legal restrictions and prohibitions and charges that have made it impossible for them to even practice their profession. So that is why I say that it's not just diminishing space, but also disappearing space. On the other hand, there are these defamation laws that have been imposed to curb criticism of public figures and overly restrictive media laws, anti-terrorism and anti-extremism laws, expanded surveillance of NGOs, and the blocking of websites and of social media, which has been used in some cases to restrict the legitimate exercise of the right to freedom of expression. Now, only the other day, a group of us were discussing the whole question of the freedom of association and assembly. And we all agreed that now freedom of assembly in particular has been so unfairly and unreasonably restricted that people thought it much better to move to the cyberspace because they felt that there the freedom of assembly is relatively easier to take benefit of. Unfortunately, I don't think that many of us present here, either in participants or in the panel, feel now in any way safe in the cyberspace as well. We have all kinds of intelligence actors who are looking in on what we are doing, what we are saying every day. And it is because of this kind of surveillance that there have been arbitrary arrests, detention, and disappearances of human rights defenders and civil society actors, especially journalists, and many times lawyers as well. So I think it's time that we thought of who can be the partners with the civil society in alleviating this trend that governments are so enthusiastically pursuing. I'm afraid in my country, we have very little faith that either the judiciary or the parliament will ever come to the rescue of the civil society. Because when the whole question of freedom of expression being used to expose violations of human rights and the destruction of the rule of law is concerned, I don't think we have many partners and many well-wishers in the institutions that should, in fact, be protecting the rights and preventing abuse of power and abuse of individual rights at any level. So independence of the judiciary, unless and until we are, we are able to ensure that, it will be very difficult for judges and courts in general to recognize the difference between genuine security concerns and attempts by governments to restrict freedoms in order to silence dissent or silence those who are exposing human rights violations and abuses. So I think this is the situation that I very briefly wanted to present, because it is extremely easy to say that the civil society will survive, which we keep saying in our effort to seem brave and in our effort to show that we are very resilient. But there will come a time when it will become extremely difficult. And structurally difficult for us to survive anymore. And there are those that are even more marginalized and therefore more vulnerable. If you look at the women human rights defenders, I think it is even more difficult for women human rights defenders to carry out their work in the way that they should, because these groups are often more vulnerable to prejudice, to marginalization and public repudiation, not only by the state, but other social actors. And we have seen how the work of civil society and human rights defenders does get affected by ultranationalism and religious extremism, and how the security of human rights defenders is affected by non-state actors who act as vigilantes. And you have seen that in India, we have seen that many times in Pakistan, and I'm sure Bangladesh is not far behind. So I will stop here, and I'm sure that others who speak after me will have the same story to tell. The question and the trick now is, how do we get together and find the pressure points and the leverage that we can use to change and make sure that these trends evaporate from the style of governance that we are experiencing currently. Thank you.
Ina, thank you very much. I know that there are already lots of questions for you. I'm going to save those for the roundtable and the Q&A in a little while. I'm going to move, please, now to our next speaker today, Rajat Khosla. Rajat joined as the Senior Director for Research, Advocacy and Policy at the International Secretariat of Amnesty International this year from the WHO, where he worked as the Human Rights Advisor for the last 7 years. He has extensive experience in various research, advocacy, legal and policy roles in organisations such as OHCHR, UNDP, the Centre for the Study of Developing Societies, the International Environmental Law Research Centre, and UNFPA. Rajat, of course, will be able to tell us, and I'm sure we look forward to hearing, if look forward is probably the wrong word, but Rajat will tell us, no doubt, all about the fact that India has recently booted out, quite extraordinarily, Amnesty International. So Rajat, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shona. And thanks to BHRC and to you personally for bringing us all together. And as Hina rightly said, I guess we will all be repeating after each other and probably picking up different pieces of this hymn. And I have to say, it makes me extremely sad and disappointed that it is the demagoguery of the ruling governments in South Asia that connects us today, rather than the rich culture and legacy on promotion and protection of human rights. Because if you see from Afghanistan to Nepal, from Maldives to Bangladesh, from India to Sri Lanka, a clear trend that emerges is that of strongman nativist political leadership, which thrives on silencing of dissent and crackdown on civic space. Hina already talked about some of the trends, but issues such as disappearances of whistleblowers, arrests and killing of human rights defenders, patterns of reprisal are the new normal today in South Asia. The situation has been further exacerbated by the outbreak, as we know, of COVID-19, which has been exploited by those in power to further restrict human rights and shrink the space for civil society. But I have to caveat my remarks by saying this has been building up for the last several years now. For a while, we have been witnessing the abandonment of moral leadership of world leaders and it being replaced by complete shamelessness. Former High Commissioner Ziad Raad al-Hussein once very famously said, you know, when we spotlight egregious abuses, we hope that a sense of embarrassment will trigger a response. However, today's leaders are so shameless that about the abuses they perpetuate that it is hard to effect any change. And I think on the contrary, they rather thrive on these abuses. And this, to me, colleagues, is the biggest challenge that we face today globally, with its dire manifestations in South Asia that we will be talking about in the next several minutes. So when I look at India, and it's just not based on the experience that we have had at Amnesty International and the recent sad incidents which led to us having to close the offices in India, but it is also a trend that has been building up, as I said, for the last several years. And I just want to highlight a few key elements of this trend as I see it. The first is the patterns of threat, intimidation, and harassment that we talked about. The first is that there is a very clear connection between what we do and the reprisals that we face. And simply speaking, the reprisals that we face are simply for us speaking out, for actually standing up and using the word human rights. And this is becoming increasingly clearer because if you look at the case of Amnesty in particular, the intimidations and the smear campaigns that we faced each coincided rather miraculously with every time we came out with a human rights report. We talked about riots in Delhi, we got smeared in public, we talked about silencing of voices in Kashmir, we got a series of threats and intimidation. So one cannot be naive not to find the pattern in terms of what's underlying all this. The second is the issue within the patterns of threats that we are facing is the state use of legislation. You already spoke about the Foreign Currency Regulation Act and the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, which have been used by the government to shut down the civic space, but also other legislations which are being used to persecute the dissenters. You know, issues, criminal law penalties such as those related to treason, terror legislations have become way too common repertoire of government control to crack down on civic space. The next trend that I feel that it is happening, that it is both vertical and horizontal crackdown is what is being manifested. It's both about the issues that we work on, as I said, but also in terms of the tools and the mechanisms that we use to work on. The silencing of media outlets, the killings, the disappearances of journalists, for instance, is all too often in terms of the news that we are getting throughout the region, and at surprisingly high levels of such incidents are being reported. The other issue that I wanted to highlight is that many people think it's sudden. It's not sudden. It's way too systemic, and it almost transcends governments in this regard. Of course, the present government in New Delhi is exploiting it to its draconian ends, but the seeds of these legislations and this crackdown started way before, and this has been building up. Therefore, in a very systemic manner, in which civil society is being pushed out and civic space is being shut down as a consequence. The next is something that Hina also briefly touched about. It's just not only physical today, but it is also digital too, and extremely systemic and dangerous in terms of the state use of surveillance on human rights defenders. So we are looking at dissent being routinely crushed both offline and online. So if you look at it all together, there are a few things that crystallize. The first is that there has been an outright criminalization of civic space. And this to me is extremely worrying. And it's extremely worrying for me, not only looking at the Indian context, but broadly as well. Because when the state starts using the strongest arm under state control, that is a criminal law, against its own population to silence their voices, there's something fundamentally wrong that is happening in a country. And for a country, especially like India, with a rich history of social movements, it's very unbecoming that grassroots human rights activists are being targeted for the work that they are doing. And I don't think I'm exaggerating if I say today, being a civil society worker working on human rights in India is probably one of the most dangerous jobs that one can do. The other side of the story is that when we look at is in terms of the complete tapering off of the national remedial processes, the independence of judiciary, the ability of individuals to seek judicial remedies for the violations that they face is a sham. And I think we need to start recognizing these issues, because this kind of is building an edifice of how a draconian regime is actually thriving and building upon one process after the other to silence all sorts of dissent and critical voices. And my final 2 points that I want to raise, the first is in terms of the disconnect between the global positioning of a country and its national level records. India and its ambitions at the Security Council, it's a member of the Human Rights Council, and it's positioning itself as a determining force in the geopolitics that's around, but at the same time closing civic space. And these disconnects ought to be questioned, but they aren't. And which brings me to the final point, is in terms of a complete disappearance of global protection mechanisms and their incapacity to respond. What we are witnessing today is a muteness of both multilaterals and I think to a large extent bilaterals as well, in their ability to stand up and call out governments for these violations of their human rights. So what we have now is a situation that is playing out that India and the geopolitical consideration tends to weigh down the extent to which governments would want to stand up and ask for accountability of what is happening. The trading relationships and the partner that India is in terms of a variety of contexts means that several, both within the multilateral and in the bilateral space, are shying in terms of calling out the human rights responsibilities of the country as such. And to me, I think I will end by saying this now has become bigger than individual entities that we are talking about. This has become bigger than any one institution. And this requires us definitely to come together, because the solutions, the usual repertoire of techniques that we have in terms of blaming and shaming, in terms of accountability structures, they're just not functioning. So the question then becomes is, then how do we hold these governments to account and ensure that the voices of people working on human rights are not silenced? Thanks, Shona. I'll hand it back to you.
Rajat, thank you very much. That was extremely interesting, and I know that there will be a lot more that we want to come back and talk to you about some of those sort of highlighted points. For now, we're going to move directly on to Sara. Sara Hussain is a barrister practicing in the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, mainly in the areas of constitutional, public interest and family law. She serves pro bono at the Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust. She's been involved in landmark cases on women's rights, the right to liberty and freedom of expression. Sara is involved with national and regional organisations on human rights, including the Human Rights Forum Bangladesh, the Committee on Fundamental Rights and South Asians for Human Rights. And again, without further ado, Sara.
Thanks a lot, Shona. I feel I'm going to be a bit of a broken record because I think I'm going to repeat exactly the themes that both Hina and Rajat have actually already identified. And I think the first thing to say is that what we're, firstly, I would like to say, I wish we were also speaking more about our activism and what continues to happen in terms of asserting rights and also challenging violations. I think it would be great if you could consider another discussion on that, because I think we have to hold on to that and the fact that that is continuing despite all of these encroachments and restrictions that are ongoing. And I think the second point is, before looking at the specifics of our context in Bangladesh and some of the recent developments, I think that this issue around democratic space and the restriction on democratic space is actually what's critical, because civil society has always been effective in alliance with progressive political movements as well. And as we've seen that the space for any kind of contested political activity has shrunk, the next group that the state has come after is civil society. And so it's difficult to forge alliances, it's difficult to amplify our voices. You really feel like you're back to the wall without any allies on either side to speak to. In our context, of course, we don't have also a particularly robust space in terms of parliamentary space, as well as the others that we talked about in terms of accountability and transparency. I'll come to discuss the situation of the judiciary in a moment. I think given that, as I said, I'm going to be a bit of a broken record, maybe it's useful for me to talk more about some of the context that we face in terms of the curtailments in cyberspace as well as in physical space. I mean, right now, of course, because of COVID, the possibility of organizing in public spaces is pretty restricted. There are still protests of different issues going on, but it's difficult. But the big threats, I think, that have been in place in Bangladesh for the last few years, which have really intimidated people, I think, from taking on many issues and organizing, is these threats of extreme violence, the reality of extrajudicial killings, not only happening to the most high-profile political activists, but happening to, in a sense, ordinary people, ordinary dissenters. The threat of disappearances, again, happening to the so-called ordinary dissenter, people who say very little at the end of the day, but face this kind of extreme violation. And also, I think the threats that the media in particular face, both of many journalists in particular who remain the real voices, I think, at the moment now, who can still hold people to account, who still can can raise their voices are not able to function as much as they could otherwise. Even our leading newspapers are not able to, because there is always this hanging over their head. So disappearances, extrajudicial killings are a particular pattern. I know Meenakshi will be able to speak much more to that, to the details of that. But I think the threat of arbitrary arrests, the threat of being implicated in not one but multiple cases, running around the country, facing, having to get endless bails from endless courts, being shown arrested in case after case, just ritual abuse of process is the norm in so many cases now that we see. So just let me go on to talk a little bit about the cyberspace situation. Many of you will have heard about this relatively new law. We have the Digital Security Act. It is the successor to the Information Communication Technology Act, which is now from 2006, so which has been around a while. Both of these laws criminalize various forms of speech. And we have to just recall that this law has come in a context where, in a country where digital space is seen as a space within which, as it is in the world, but Bangladesh has made a big point about this, that we have a digital Bangladesh policy. We see digital space as being critical to development, to mobilization of people. We have a 700 million ICT industry. We have a 43 million, internet, so more than I think now internet subscribers. So it's a very, very important space for operation. And it's actually within these developments of the rise in the industry, the rise of the internet users, that we've seen these laws come into being. The ICT Act came in order to be facilitative, but it had that famous Section 57, which became the only thing anyone knew about the ICT Act. Now with the Digital Security Act, we've repeated the same kinds of offenses: criminal defamation for online speech, hurt to religious sentiment, again, grafted, onto this new law in terms of online hurt to religious sentiment. And then the innovations. As I said, we're proud of our digital innovations. I think as a people, we're not proud of the innovations in the Digital Security Act of these new criminal offenses. But some of them are the offense of hurting the image of the nation. If you compare it to even the colonial era, offenses of sedition, sedition is a walk in the park compared to hurt to the image of the nation. It's even more vague. Which image, who defines? Utterly subjective, and that is used repeatedly, not for hurt, actually anything that you could objectively see in any way affecting the nation at large, but for any kind of comment about high officials of government, very political leaders, even family members of high-level political leaders. We have other offenses created under this of any kind of propaganda against the liberation war, any kind of propaganda against the father of the nation and the national anthem. There's no proper definition of what these mean. There's also an offense to even do any kind of assistance in carrying out propaganda. So there's no precision in the definition, and there are extraordinarily disproportionate penalties. A second offense includes a life sentence as a potential penalty. There are other provisions about causing offense, annoyance, etc., creating hostility amongst people. The numbers of cases is pretty terrifying. Just this year alone, we haven't even ended the year, we have over 800 cases have been filed. Even during the COVID period, when the police were particularly busy dealing with other matters, lockdown and so on, within the first 3 months of the COVID period from March, 89 cases were filed against more than 150 individuals, including more than 20 journalists. You can see no one is sitting around as far as this law is concerned. If I just give you one example of a recent case, there was a case against the so-called Facebook 11 case, which included allegations against a cartoonist who made a cartoon about something to do with the COVID response. He remains in jail, having been imprisoned in May. And it seems that there's a challenge to this particular law. It's not being heard currently, given the restrictions and given the limited space and time in courts. But the possibility of getting any kind of accountability for these kinds of incredibly egregious violations seems very minimal. And in most cases, people are just running after bail orders, just trying to secure the release of people who are spending months in jail during the COVID period, where there aren't proper safeguards for anyone in the jails in terms of their safety. Incidents of torture have happened, torture and ill treatment of individuals who've been arrested under these cases, including journalists. One of the most notorious, another journalist called Shafiqul Islam Kajul, who was initially disappeared for 54 days after, from March onwards, and then reappeared only to be arrested in repeated cases of criminal defamation, and again remains in custody even now. So, and in addition to the arrests and detentions, we see frequent blocking, taking down of pages and so on. I think one of the really pernicious things about how this law is being used, it's not only that these arrests and detentions are happening and that ultimately, of course, you get some kind of relief, but how the cases are being started. The police are filing many of them, but many are also being initiated by individuals, party members often, ruling party members, often people who are not necessarily ruling party members, but maybe sycophants of some kind, camp followers. There seems to be no process of check and balance. You know, the police can say when they receive this case, they shouldn't file it if it doesn't have any basis. Magistrates can look into the allegations, but it doesn't happen. They get filed, they move, and they have a life of their own. And a person has been in jail for 3 months or 5 months before anyone actually effectively can intervene. So why these trigger-happy processes are there with no proper protection against them, and they're accompanied. And so even though, as I said, maybe the cases of 800 sounds like not very many in a country of 160 million, but for the 160 million, it's the fear that you have this hanging over your head, that you may have a police officer who has powers to arrest you without warrant, who has powers which he or she which they do exercise to come into your home in the middle of the night and take you away. Take away your devices, make up allegations, and hold you indefinitely. That's the real fear that many people are living with. I mean, I don't have very much more time, so I just want to wrap up with saying I think that the other issues I wanted to mention, which again have been mentioned already by Hina and Rajat, are also the restrictions on civil society organizations. We also have these requirements that you have to register to receive any kind of foreign donations for your work. The laws we have also, in fact, have another speech-related offense, that any kind of critical commentary around any constitutional body could also lead to your organization being taken over, having its board taken over, and your organization being suspended and so on. You have regular checks, you have pre-monitoring by intelligence agencies before any kind of grant can be processed, before any organization can be registered under the NG Bureau. And these are all seen as matter of course and nothing much to question. And in terms of accountability mechanisms, as I said, our courts were closed for the first few days under COVID. They are now functional, our lower courts, and our Supreme Court is also functioning with both virtual and physical benches. It is very much the place of last resort where we do have to go. There are lots of issues and concerns, but at least we are being able to get orders and a release and so on. But we're seeing the pressure on the courts as well. And I think that I just want to end with the points that Rajat was raising, that again, as we see South Asian countries sort of repositioning themselves, Bangladesh is proud of the fact it's about to become a middle-income country. We take the language of, we want to see ourselves as a leader in terms of achievement of SDGs. We want to see ourselves, and can in some ways see ourselves as a leader in terms of gender equality and addressing issues of discrimination. Our social indicators are often pointed to. So it raises a big question about why is there all of that language on the one hand, and this completely separate reality in terms of ongoing human rights violations and lack of accountability. It also raises questions about the capacity and willingness, I think, and will of the international community to engage with the issue of human rights violations, whether it's multilaterals and their relative ineffectiveness, or it's what we have, and we have to ensure that they engage ineffective or not, relatively ineffective or not, but also with bilaterals. Again, the discussion of Bangladesh being middle income, Bangladesh becoming a trade partner, and that being the driving force in how conversations and engagements happen, rather than calling out human rights violations, rather than saying that there have to be some minimal conditions of, for these kinds of engagements and relationships to flourish, is also, I think, another place which is another reason restricting the possibilities for us to bring attention to bear on the human rights scenario here. And I think, sorry, just if I can do one last point. And I think that another real problem for us, as I said, we have brave actors, activists, lawyers, journalists, civil society organizations still speaking out, still documenting, reporting, analyzing, standing in the streets, taking up their, being active on their keyboards in cyberspace and so on. But what we also see is a lot of people stepping away, stepping back, not being willing to be part of the process any longer. People who a decade ago, 2 decades ago, we would have stood shoulder to shoulder. People would have stood up for each other and supported each other. Now are not doing it because they're now seeing too many benefits available to them. This is also part of the middle income process. I think that there are too many opportunities, too many benefits. People want to be part of the system. They want to get the advantages. We see that in our profession and in others. We see that in civil society, civil society as well, taking the easy opportunities. And on the other, we see this process of just going with the flow, supporting it. And then I'm saying beyond the people who are being perhaps, deeply partisan and deeply compromised, there's also this other space which no one wants to get into it. No one wants to take the risks, and people also want to take the opportunities. So I think that we have to, I would really love if we could follow this discussion with looking at, and maybe ask some of those who are attending to speak with us about some of the ways that we can build civil society relationships at this time. And part of an organization called South Asians for Human Rights, which Hina is one of the founders of course. It's one tiny little voice, but I think that this is one of the ways we can get together, is for South Asians across the region to reach out to professionals like those who are on this call, I think, from other countries as well, to focus attention on the concerns we have and see how we can work together to still carry on highlighting the issues that we have, because the shrinking of civil society means that we end up otherwise with our back to the wall, feeling we can no longer reach out, we can't speak to others, we don't have room to breathe. And I think we have to, this is part of sort of changing that dynamic, and thank you, Shona, for facilitating that. I'm sorry, I've really taken a lot of time, I apologize. Move over to Meenakshi.
Please don't apologize at all, Sarah. I wish I could say it was a pleasure to hear from all of you. It's of course a pleasure to be on a panel with all of you, but of course the subjects we're talking about are really as far from a pleasure as possible. And to give us then an overview of the issues that we're talking about in civil society in South Asia, our last panelist is Meenakshi Ganguly. Meenakshi has overseen Human Rights Watch's work in South Asia since 2010. She's worked on a broad range of issues across the region, including police reform, sexual violence, discrimination based on religion or caste, freedom of expression, and armed conflict. Meenakshi served as the South Asia correspondent for Time magazine prior to joining Human Rights Watch, covering Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And so, Meenakshi, over to you.
Thank you, Shona, and how nice to, how depressing, but how nice to be on a panel, because I always find it inspiring when I hear from my colleagues. It just makes me feel like it's all worth it after all. We will eventually prevail is how I feel about it. Shona, thank you so much for sort of letting me have the last word, so to speak. In terms of this region, South Asia, it's interesting that at this point of time, almost all the countries are in fact democracies, and they have had various journeys towards that space, but that's where we are. And unfortunately, we are at what is called illiberal democracies. We are also, that's what we've become, which is really unfortunate, because the struggles were painful to arrive where we did. And others have spoken about the problems, and I just wanted to take a little step back and say that there are the sort of governments that we have right now are popular governments. They've been elected with large numbers, and therefore we should also look to where they draw their strength from and how they have played those that support them. So in terms of the pressures on civil society, on the pressures on freedom of expression and association, there is both the state, and all the other panelists have spoken about state actions, but also members of the public who sometimes, of course, are also supporters of the government and enjoy the political patronage and protection of the state. Briefly, to talk about the sort of the public and how the state uses perhaps this public voice, whether it is protests on the streets, or whether it is trolling on social media, or other platforms that are being used broadcast television, often to promote sort of divisive messages. And this can be on a range of issues. We are seeing protests in Pakistan over blasphemy. We are seeing in India advertisements being taken down because a jewelry company promoted communal harmony. This threat has, in many cases, been used, therefore, by the state to then also say, oh, there is a threat to public order, and therefore these voice, this book should be banned, this film should be banned, and so on and so forth. So there is sometimes the use of public pressure also by the state to curb free speech and freedom of association and civil society efforts. This, of course, has had serious outcomes. I mean, in the Maldives, in Bangladesh, we've had bloggers that have been killed. In Pakistan, a friend of mine, Gauri Lankesh, was killed. So in Pakistan, we know people have been disappeared. So there is a deadly consequence to this kind of fanning of sort of public outrage, so to speak, over various issues, which then culminates in an actual law and order problem, in actual physical threats, which leads people to also, it has a chilling effect on freedom of association and on civil society and on freedom of speech. Followed, of course, then is some that all my colleagues have just spoken about, which are state actions to curb free speech. And this, the laws that have been mentioned, the Digital Security Act in Bangladesh, sedition laws that have been, once upon a time used by the colonials, now being used vastly in India. Blasphemy laws in Pakistan, the Prevention of Terrorism Act in Sri Lanka. In Nepal, journalists were arrested for reporting a story on the Dalai Lama, just because that might offend China. Tibetan groups can no longer protest, or their freedom of association is curbed, again, because there might be some concerns from China. So, one of the biggest challenge, and because we haven't really spoken about Sri Lanka and Maldives, I'm just going to touch a little bit upon these two countries. Sri Lanka had, and I think we have the former chair of the Human Rights Commission as one of the participants. It had 5 years where Sri Lankans actually enjoyed, in a way, a greater civic space than what existed before the 2015 elections and the previous Mahinda Rajapaksa government. Now in 2019, Mahinda Rajapaksa's brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa is president, and within a very short span of time, the 5 years that existed, where there was much more freedom for activists, much more civil society space, is already under threat. There is increased surveillance. People, families of disappeared persons are being threatened. Lawyers are being threatened, and there's a man called Ramzi Razik who's in prison right now because he criticized the cremation of Muslims if they were victims of COVID-19. There's a lawyer who's also been in prison under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So these are things that have already started happening to great extent. Similarly, we found Sarah mentioned at length the crackdown that is occurring on free speech and on critics, and on the very vague laws that are being used in Bangladesh. Nepal has drafted new laws, pretty much replicating laws that are existing in other parts of South Asia, including the FCRA in India or the sort of DSA in Bangladesh, to try and curb speech in Bangladesh. In Nepal. These laws are still pending in Parliament and hopefully will not be enacted, but they have been drafted. And finally, of course, Rajat has spoken at length of India, but I do want to say that we want to also understand the political motivations that are driving the massive crackdown that is happening on dissent in India. And one of the cases that came up recently was the arrest of a journalist who runs a very, very loud pro-government network. Now, he should not have been arrested, and certainly he should have gotten bail, as the Supreme Court has said he should. But unfortunately, we have also seen that various other people have not had the benefit of that same judicial intervention, that same protection of constitutional freedoms, whether it is people in Kashmir who are now there are a bunch of human rights activists and lawyers who have just been faced raids. There are activists in jail, whether it is around the citizenship law protests or whether it was against the Bhima Koregaon cases. So there is a large number of people who are seen to be perhaps not, perhaps to be critics of the present government who are now in prison. Now, the reason I've started in the beginning with, and it's something that other people have already spoken about, it is that this has been a slow thing. This is not the present government itself. Right now, the government that exists in place perhaps are not acting in the way that they should, or enjoying what might have been the slow slide in the freedom of speech and expression that have already existed in the region. For instance, in Maldives, there was it was a civil society movement that brought the Soli administration into power. And yet we find that one of the biggest groups, the Maldivian Democracy Network, which was one of the biggest human rights groups in the Maldives, took enormous chances, was threatened over social media for having offended Islam, and is now out of the country. And the Soli administration has not been able to do very much about it. So sometimes we find that governments are not stepping up enough, even when they perhaps would have been expected to do so. It's nearing the end of our hour. So I just want to, because it's depressing, I want to try and bring it back to something that could be positive. And I want to again go back to the history of this region. The history of this region is one where civil society has led movements that have seen the overthrowing of military dictators, of monarchs, of abusive leaderships, of a colonial power. We have that history. In Bangladesh, we often hear, it's a Bengali term, it's called Buddhijivi, and there is an entire sort of class of people who are called Buddhijivis, or intellectuals. And perhaps we need a new form of intellectuals now. We need to create, perhaps what has happened is that the human rights language that we've used has not quite appealed to the people who are now supporting really authoritarian tendencies of the leadership, who are giving up on the same civil liberties that brought them the voices that they have right now. Because, and therefore we need to speak, we need to create a movement where we are able to once again try and put human rights at the core of South Asia, really. And we really need to do that. I just want to say one word on why we need to do that, because right now, a lot of people have mentioned on chat about technology. And yes, social media, the internet has brought to us the capacity to talk with each other as we are right now. And that same capacity can be shut down with the hit of a button. Internet shutdowns is the ultimate tool that the state these days wields to just shut all of us up. So I'll stop there and we can go back to discussions. Thank you.
And actually, thank you very much for that, again, extremely illuminating whistle-stop tour of some of the different ways in which we see the space being violated for human rights defenders and civil society more generally. And some interesting snapshots also we see of what's happening in Kashmir, in Nepal, Maldives, Sri Lanka. Now, I want to engage a little bit with the questions that we have, and we have a number of very interesting questions both on the chat and in the Q&A. One of the questions that we have comes specifically, I just wanted to ask this question, Rajat, for you from Vikasha Sachdev. Vikasha is a journalist with Quint in India, and he says that, as you pointed out, the crackdown on civil society in India is a long-term systemic issue. The expansion of the UAPA was made by the UPA in 2008, for instance. But what, Rajat, would you characterize as the specific ways in which the crackdown has taken place since 2014? And what would you say are the differences between the current regime and previous governments? So, Rajat, to you, please.
Thank you so much, Shona. And just to say, it's been such a wonderful conversation, hearing colleagues speak. Just before answering the question, I do have to say, and Meenakshi rightly pointed out, we need to try and also think about what underpins some of this. And I think that kind of gets to the question that the colleague from Quint has. And we have been faced with times of uncertainty, and as somebody rightly said, at times of uncertainty, demagogues thrive, and that's what seems to have happened, is that while populism has been used to do this constant othering, whether it is that of Muslims, whether that is of other religious minorities, and so on and so forth, at the same time to thrive on that polarization and that fear. And I think that is what is happening. And if I look at the situation, and absolutely, I think there is the seeds of this present legislation were sown in the previous administration. What is different is probably the bruteness with which it is being executed, for first and foremost. The complete denial by the government for any values which are constitutional values in context of India is rather stunning. And I think the extent to which it has been able to drive this brute force while dealing with poets, with academics, it's unprecedented in terms of what has actually been happening. And then I think so. Therefore, that's been a very defining feature on the way it is being done. So, and add to that, there has been a clear targetedness on who is being targeted and what is being targeted as a consequence. And then I think and one cannot be in denial. If you look at the BJP manifesto, it's very clear. It is a manifesto commitment, the FCRA, and that they are going to stop all funding to foreign funding for work of civil society in the country, and they are literally doing exactly that, what they had put in their election manifesto. What one does not quite understand is these disconnects that are coming in terms of government's lofty claims in New York and in Geneva, but at the same time, complete dismantling of the architecture in-house. But and constantly, but at the same time, it's very happy to fund right-wing Hindu nationalist organizations to do what they want to do and give them a clear hand. So there is a clear playing of the agendas that is happening, which is what I think make what is happening within the present administration all too distinct. Thanks, Shona.
Sorry, thank you very much. Roger, thank you. And one of the questions that I think comes up time and again, and it's coming up in different forms on the Q&A, but is really about the ability of the Supreme Courts, or courts in general, to protect against this diminishment or disappearance of space for civil society. And we've heard from each of you, I think, about different ways in which the courts are either unable or unwilling across the different countries of South Asia to be able to be free either of political interference and influence, or simply not to be independent enough to be able to engage sufficient protection for these sorts of issues. So I want to ask Hina, first of all, what your view is on the interaction between these issues and the courts, and more specifically the Supreme Court of Pakistan.
Let me combine this with another question I've just seen on the Q&A, which is why do democratically elected governments use the national security paradigms in order to clamp down on civil society? And this, I think, is in many ways related to the influence that the security apparatus in our countries have on both the courts and governments. Now, in the case of Pakistan, I can tell you of many laws which have recently been legislated by parliaments, but they are so uniform. These are different provincial laws. And one text has been adopted at the same time with all the 4 provincial assemblies, which means that they were constructed somewhere and the legislatures were told to pass these laws. So in many ways, these institutions of democracy, like the parliament, or the rule of law institution like the Supreme Court in Pakistan, or other courts in South Asia, I think they are overly influenced by the security paradigm over here. And this
paranoia about security, it has seeped into the administration of justice as much as it has seeped into governments. So it doesn't matter if you have a military regime like in Pakistan or a democratically elected government, the state will always enhance its power to control. And if the state is weak, it is only weak in its ability to protect. So while states are growing more and more powerful in being able to control, they are using, in many ways, security narratives, not based on a genuine risk assessment of security, but these security narratives more and more seem like narratives that are adopted to silence and put fear in their own populations.
Hina, thank you. I wonder, Meenakshi, whether you might be able to add to that on Sri Lanka, because I know BHRC has recently commented on a lawyer who's been detained under terrorism provisions in Sri Lanka. And I wonder whether you might have something to say about that interaction between the courts and the protection of civic society space more recently and right now and more recently in Sri Lanka.
It is true that right now, wherever we go, we have also seen that courts have upheld human rights in many places. So if you look back at the history of South Asia, quite often we've had effective courts that have stepped in with good jurisprudence, which have sometimes upheld fundamental freedom cases. And therefore, it is interesting that, for instance, in Hizbullah's case, that he's been held under PTA. He's not even had a court hearing until now. He's been held under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So it is almost as though, and this is something that I mean, Rajat can speak to this a little bit more. But in India, there was a culture of public interest litigation, and that led to a lot of jurisprudence, which eventually came up to upholding rights, including the rights of LGBT people in India, and getting rid of 377. But we've also found at the same time that same kind of litigation now being used to curb speech. So it's almost as though the tools that were used are now being used also by supporters, by pro-government lawyers who will file case after case, defamation suits, or other cases, or cases of having been offended repeatedly to also destroy the space for civil society.
Thank you, Rajat. I wonder if you might like to come in on that, because there is this contradiction, certainly looking at the Indian Supreme Court, there is a sort of contradiction between a court that has been willing to uphold quite creative, innovative looks at civil liberties. And for example, if you look at the Section 377 cases and LGBT rights, you see a court that looks outwardly very progressive and a champion of human rights. And then you see what's happened over the Kashmir cases, for example, and you see a court that seems to be blocking. I think both Sarah and Hina were talking about the use of process effectively as a blocking factor, and we've seen that in the Kashmir cases. We've also seen similar incidents relating to the riots in Delhi earlier this year, where you see the courts being used and abused in different ways. So how do you see that process playing out in India? You're on mute.
Thanks, Shona. Thank you. Extremely sadly, if I would say, as somebody who actually practiced, albeit very briefly, in that institution, I have to say it's very saddening and extremely concerning what is happening to the Supreme Court, but also to judiciary overall. And I think there is an underlying trend of accountability deficit that is creeping in through different institutions. And I don't think it's about the institution as such, because I think the Supreme Court of India was the beacon of hope, and for all of us, from a variety of petitions, from speedy trials to public interest litigations related to housing rights and right to food and so on. what has become of the court is what is concerning. And then I think what has become of the court is that systematically governments after governments have been trying to ebb away the independence of the judiciary and to exert control from one mechanism to the other. And this has been happening very carefully crafted operation over the last at least 7 to 8 years in more proactive form, but I think one could see the trends of it starting to happen even within the previous administration. This administration takes it to the hilt, in a matter of speaking. And what has happened is that there have been issues, and the way the judiciary's independence has been compromised, from appointments to the elevations, to the Chief Justice of India and the offices as well, has become extremely carefully crafted in a manner that you do not have these independence of judiciary considerations, which was almost a no-go until like 25-30 years back, because this would be a mechanism that one could actually knock on the doors of and expect the kind of relief that one anticipated. But what we have now is both a judiciary that has been extremely compromised at one end, but at the other, extremely aware of their political masters. And that's a very dangerous recipe for any country, for that matter. And this is a trend that has become, to the extent that, at one point, while they are ready to use their activism to hear bail applications such as those that Meenakshi was talking about in context of the journalist in this case, and provide him with the relief, but at the same time turn a complete blind eye to the dozens others who are languishing in the jails for want of relief. So I think there is, two or three things which are coming very clearly. One is the way in which the judiciary and the judicial functioning has been compromised, the level of political influence that has creeped into from the executive to the judiciary, and then the selective application of the judicial provost that is happening, whereby they are very happy to use the long arm of the law in certain cases and provide relief, but in the other cases they will threaten contempt, they will threaten all sorts of things to basically get the government what the government desires. So I think it's a very dangerous recipe that is coming together, but at the same time with very little accountability. Thanks, Shona.
Thank you, Rajat. And Sarah, I wanted to, you hinted at this in your earlier talk about the way in which process can be used effectively to block. I wonder what ideas you might have. There's definitely a thirst, I think, amongst our audience and some of the questions that we're getting. There is a thirst to know how we might be able to, as lawyers and as civil society, how we might be able to advance the obstacles that are being put in our way through governments, but also through courts. So I wonder what constructive ideas you might have for those in the audience about how we progress these cases.
Like maybe reinventing some old tools might be something we could think about. Court monitoring is something we haven't done for a long time in our context anyway. And I think that trying to track some of these cases of harassment of activists would be something useful to do. People have been looking a lot at the DSA, as I mentioned, but there are other tools also of harassment that are used. Ancient stuff, criminal defamation, sedition, these are routinely rolled out as well, not just the fancy DSA electronic stuff, right? Not just the online stuff, but these other ones are still rolled out. And they're laughable if you look at the case, right? You wouldn't think it could last for a second. If it takes 2 minutes of analysis to identify it, really it's just a joke. And yet, as I said, it continues. So I think that having that kind of analysis and monitoring done of these cases, and having human rights organizations, legal professionals from different jurisdictions with high standing, looking at this kind of stuff and highlighting it over and over again, is one way to, and as I said, it's an old, I'm not inventing anything new. This is what people used to do. But we've kind of stopped doing these things a little bit, quite a lot, completely. And I think that is something we could definitely look at. And I think that, again, dialogues are very useful as well, because people need to feel, Meenakshi was saying, she feels better when we talk to each other. we tend to talk, we tend to forget that we can do that because, as I said, you're just struggling all the time to deal with things. I think that's another thing that in these bizarre COVID times is somehow possible. We can get together, right, like this, exactly over Zoom. And I think for more practitioners to be able to do that with each other across our borders is another useful way where you can highlight some of the issues we are facing and how we deal with them. I think for the judiciary as well, there are many concerns, but it still remains the case that that's where you have to go. There isn't anywhere else to go when you want to get that bail order. There is nowhere else to go when you need to challenge something. Of course, there's the media, and that's where you raise the questions. So I think we have to remember that there are also members of the judiciary who are perhaps even more embattled than we are as lawyers. And I think that would be something to, I don't have any easy answers. I don't know whether dialogues are sufficient or not, but maybe highlighting when positive actions happen there is something that would give confidence and strength to people. One issue I should mention, one of the really appalling things that happened in Bangladesh, our former Chief Justice, who gave some of the most important judgments on human rights actually that we've had, is currently in a peculiar situation of facing charges in the Bangladesh courts of various things, including corruption and so on, effectively being exiled abroad. And this is an issue that has had almost no attention from any international human rights organization, or indeed much of the international community. It's very difficult. I mean, I'm thinking twice in even mentioning this because we don't even speak about it because the repercussions are high. But I think I should put that on the record, and it should be an issue that gets looked at. Is terrible things have happened to senior judges in other jurisdictions as well in our region. But I think that we should highlight these things again and not leave them as untold stories, that we just sort of whisper about.
Well, Sarah, one of the things that the Bar Human Rights Committee tries to do is, in fact, highlight these sorts of cases. So now you've put this on our radar, we can certainly speak about this more. And I think that is one of the things that these dialogues do, is that they do make us all aware of things that don't necessarily come out on a broader basis. Now, one of the themes that I think has come out from everything you've said, but also through the questions, is how do we speak outwards? Because here we are speaking inwards. All of us around this panel are human rights lawyers or working within the human rights field. And so there is a dialogue that goes on between us. And I think a theme of some of the questions and more broadly is that the language that we speak between us doesn't seem to be heard more broadly outside. And I think Meenakshi spoke about, the fact that we have in this region democratically elected governments who have been elected on a platform which is either a platform of sort of succeeding on anti-national or nationalism, I should say, and often populism, which has devalued or sought to devalue the language of human rights. So in a sense, I'd like to open this out. I'm going to start with Hina, but I would like to open this out to you all, is how do we make that language count, both domestically and internationally again? And this is a huge challenge of our times. It's not limited to South Asia. It's a challenge that we in Britain face. It's a challenge that really has been faced, we've seen across the Atlantic and just everywhere. How do we make the language of human rights count to a wider population that needs to understand what's at stake when civil society disappears? Hina.
I don't know about other countries in South Asia, but I can certainly say this for my own country, that when it comes to a situation of crisis, like the one that we are presently undergoing with the economic deprivations that have resulted from the COVID situation and the increasing inequalities and the kind of visibility that has been given to the inequalities at the social and economic level, people do pay attention to human rights. So I'm not really very much in agreement with this, that the human rights language in some way has to change. The problem with us is not the people. The problem with us is that of the governments and the institutions. We have all been speaking about how our governments have been very quick in adopting draconian laws to silence dissent. We know of judiciaries that are lacking in independence. And I'm not just talking about judiciaries that are under pressure from the executive. In many ways, judiciary, sometimes the judiciary, especially our Supreme Courts, have in fact been very much partners of governments who are repressing people. And in the current context about which we are speaking, it doesn't really help when all this ultra-nationalist rhetoric includes the whole question of civil society actors and human rights defenders tarnishing the image of our countries by speaking out and exposing the failures of governments or their violation of human rights and the rule of law. Courts have also reacted. And I've had, even in the Supreme Court, people looking at me and saying, what the hell? You guys are bringing disrepute to our country. So why should we have any soft spot for your rights? Although I must say that even in Pakistan Supreme Court, which doesn't have a very good record of either protecting democracy or upholding human rights, there have been individual judges who have given very good judgments. But by and large, you see that in the Supreme Court judgments, these fundamental freedoms are venerated. But when it comes to actually applying that freedom to a particular person, they are not given sufficient relief. So we've had political parties banished, banned, and freedom of association totally put aside. We have had NGO laws that have been challenged, but courts have failed to take that up on the basis largely of, state, national interest and security, etc. Now they're using the FATF regulations to dry us of our sources. Or fiscal rules, laws and regulations to dry us of our resources. So counter, money laundering, terrorist financing, all these things are being now put forward, and they put the courts on a back foot in many ways. So I do think that this is what we have to tackle. And I don't know if we need to change our human rights language or make people more aware of their human rights. I think people know what their rights are. We have to tackle the governments and the propaganda that governments do.
Thank you, Hina. Meenakshi, can I turn to you? Really with the same reflections. I mean, is this a problem of the language of human rights, or is this a problem of the co-option of the language of human rights? And if it's the latter, what steps do activists, civil society, lawyers take to correct it?
I just want to talk a little bit about something that I touched upon initially as well, which is how are these state actions being enabled in a way, what Hina just talked about. And that is not that we have to teach people about human rights, but we have to perhaps once again speak to the value of civil liberties instead of forever, because somehow states have managed to persuade a large section of population, and we see this in the numbers that voted for Trump, for instance, that that they somehow have been able to persuade a large section of people that somehow the civil liberties can be compromised for the greater good. One of the things that we found shocking is what happened in Kashmir and the silence that surrounded the outrage that occurred in August 2019. That an entire set of people were left without any freedom of movement, without the freedom to communicate. They did not have phone lines to tell each other how they are. I mean, that level of repression, which is why I ended my initial presentation with the government ultimately holds the button to shut us all down because they can switch off our internet. So what I'm saying is that at this point of time, the fact that that kind of repression was visited upon a people, guised in the sort of civil liberties, in the national security argument or the greater good argument, is something that has to be countered. It has to be countered in the narrative of human rights, in why it matters. And I think that is our challenge. And you're right, we are speaking to people who are probably in agreement with each other, and we need to sort of perhaps take that message outwards. And how we do it, who knows, hopefully with the internet still on.
Thank you, Meenakshi. Sarah, I wonder if you'd like to contribute to that, because, excuse me, I'm so sorry. One of the, I think almost your starting gambit about an hour ago was, you know, we have to speak to the positive work that we're doing. We have to speak to the activities that we are engaged in to hold governments to account. And I wonder, as we come to the end of this illuminating session, and I know that we've so much more to say, but Sarah, I wonder whether you would like to reflect on those activities that are being undertaken by lawyers, by civil society, to hold governments in the region to account, and to attempt to shift the narrative on human rights and on, broadly, I think you spoke also about socioeconomic rights, about community space.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think that lawyers, activists, journalists, everyone, there are many groups that remain active right across our region and continue to challenge, you know, violations as they see them. So I think that, and we, you know, we take courage from what we see happening in other countries in the region, exactly as we also step back with, you know, shock each time we see the kind of developments we've been discussing here. So I think that the instances, whether it's strategic litigation, whether it's individual cases, whether it's progressive orders, whether it's, you know, release of people from custody, whether it's identifying the kind of abuses that are happening in cases of arbitrary arrest, whether it's also celebrating some of the instances of accountability that happen. In Bangladesh, we had finally our first judgment under the Torture and Custodial Death Act. We've also had finally police officers finally being brought to account in relation to a series of alleged acts of extrajudicial execution. So, you know, in a situation where everyone had known for years that there's total untouchability, a total impossibility in terms of any kind of possible action. So incidents like that, you know, situations like that are happening. As they happen, I think we need to hear more about them. And I'd like to just repeat my invitation to you to think about another discussion where we come together and look at exactly what are some of the specifics where there has been still, there's been a fight back, there's been questioning, there have been wins, because I think that will help us move forward in terms of looking at the kinds of alliances that are constructive and productive. And I'd also would like to reiterate with Hina as well, I don't think we should be shy and nervous about human rights language. It's what we've got. We've got we've got our constitutions, we've got human rights language. People fought and died for these things. We shouldn't set them aside. That's what we've got, that's our weaponry, and we have to utilize it. And I think people do believe in it. I don't think people don't believe in human rights, and I don't think people don't understand human rights. They're silenced for talking about it and doing things about it. As Rajat said at the very beginning, it's when people invoke human rights, that's when they get hit. That's when they get slapped back. That's not a reason to abandon it. It's just a reason to speak even more loudly.
Sarah, that's a really positive note for us all to reflect on, and certainly an invitation to BHRC to organise another event where we can celebrate some of the wins. And I think you are right, it is important. You know, we spend a lot of time as a human rights community focusing on all that is negative, and that's inevitable and important. But perhaps you're right that celebrating some of the things that actually work, some of those rare successes, may in fact act as a tool to encourage others to take up the mantle too. Now, we're very fast running out of time, and I want to thank all of the audience for staying with us so long. But I have one further question that I'd like to pose to all of you, I hope with relatively quick answers to encourage you to finish in the time that we've got available. But the event is very much focused on South Asia, but of course we at BHRC are focused and based here in London and more broadly within England and Wales. And there has been a call by some of you to say, well, what's the international community able to do? You know, I think one of you talked about the space in trade deals. I think one of you talked about the space in bilateral relations and multilateral organizations. And so as a sort of final parting thought today, I'd like to invite each of you to contribute your suggestions for how the international community, in whatever form, is able to support civil society to fight back against the disappearance. So I'm going to start with Rajat, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shona. I think three very quick points. First is, I think in terms of tactics, I would say the more effective we are in terms of using global spaces, the more likely we are able to get our governments reacting and being responsive to some of these demands. The fact is that we haven't been able to strategically make good of the global spaces to get to effect the change. My second point is, and this is deeply worrying for me, and we haven't really talked about it in as great detail, is in terms of creating safe spaces. Today, more than ever, we are having a very, very dire backlash against human rights defenders across the countries that we are talking about. But there are no safe spaces anymore for these human rights defenders. If we can actually use the mechanisms on hand to provide the kind of safe spaces that they need, is going to be extremely useful, not only in terms of pushing back against the pushback, but also in terms of providing the protection that is needed. And you know, the best example on this is Nobel laureate Denis Mukwege and his work in Congo, and the fact that we needed to provide the kind of safety to him so that he will continue to do the work. But we need that for the grassroots activists. And my final point is learning from each other. You know, there are wins even amongst ourselves. What are the tactics? What works? Can we take it to scale? And I think we need to keep on interacting, and we need to keep on not only dialoguing with each other who are in the subcontinent, but actually dialoguing with others who are actually fighting same battles but in other spaces. And what is it that we can do, and how do we take it to scale? Thank you.
Thank you, Rajat. And I just, in that vein, I just want to say that it won't be a surprise to any of you on the panel, and probably many of you in the audience today, that some of the issues that we're talking about do stretch much more widely than South Asia. And I can say, as a barrister practicing in England, that lawyers have been under attack by our own government in England, by the Home Secretary and indeed by the Prime Minister. You know, we've been accused of being activists, we've been called lefty lawyers, and so there is all of that surrounding a piece of a bill that's before Parliament at the moment, in which the government's proposing breaking international law. So some of the things that we're talking about are actually much more widespread around the world, and I do agree that we can take ideas from each other and think about collectively how we tackle these matters. I'm going to turn next to Sarah, please. Still on mute.
I had various windows open, sorry, but yeah, just I think to repeat others again, I think that the dialogue, continuing the dialogue, and one thing perhaps for those of you in the UK, I just saw in the news today that the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office is apparently going to have some massive budget cut. I think you should argue against that as much as you can, to the extent your voices will be heard. And I think particularly, I noticed that they said that human rights would still be a priority area. I think human rights and justice are two priority areas that need to be retained. And we need to kind of, for those parts of the international community that do still carry on officially saying they do support human rights work, they need to look at actually put them, money where the mouth is, to the extent the mouth is still there, of course, with that caveat. So I think that would be useful. And I think building the dialogue would be useful. And I think legal professionals reaching out to others, not just across South Asia, from South Asia to beyond, as you've done today. I think that would be a very concrete and specific thing to do as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Meenakshi.
Thank you. You know, after the war ended in Sri Lanka, the UN evaluated its own role in what they've done. It was called the Petri Report. And it basically found that the UN, the exchange, swapped access, swapped the ability to deal with government to actually speak for human rights. And it showed the compromise of one of the strongest institutions there was. So when we speak about institutions, I think that really that standard is something that needs to be upheld over and over again. We cite the Petri Report again now about Sri Lanka and about Myanmar, which again failed, where the UN systems failed. So I think there is a lot for the international community where they are driven, as Rajat mentioned earlier, on by strategic interests, to also speak to the principles that that exist. And the reason I say this is because the reason civil society in these countries is under threat, the reason that they are being silenced, is because their leaders don't want these voices to be speaking out at all. So they don't like the criticism. They know they are in the wrong. So all the more enable civil society. Make sure that that there is some pressure on abusive actors.
And actually, thank you. And so I think, as is probably fitting, our last words today to Hina Jalani, please.
Well, I totally agree with what Rajat has said, and would have been what I would have said in the first place. I think we have to step into those spaces which now seem to be deserted in some ways. Like, you know, the UN Human Rights Council, for instance, where we as human rights groups used to be able to speak out and speak to governments in many ways. Because in our darkest hours in Pakistan, I think international pressure worked to give us some relief. And I think if I'm alive today, mostly it is because of that international pressure at the most difficult times. So I think that is important. At the moment, I also think that, you know, institutions like the EU, where the GSP plus, etc., and these trade, I don't know what you call them, leverages can be used in that way against our governments. But we have to organize ourselves and collectively talk to these institutions and make them recognize and understand that they can help in this way, and that some kind of pressure you know, from these systems will help us. The other thing, of course, in our case, a lot of terrible laws have now been imposed just to satisfy the FATF. I think we need to, especially in Pakistan, we need to talk to the FATF and make them understand how their name is being used to diminish the space for civil society. In fact, they are annihilating civil societies in many countries in the name of these fiscal regulations that are drying us of our resources and allowing governments to infringe on our autonomy and our choice on how and on what we are supposed to work in our countries.
Hina, thank you very much with that call to action, and I hope some positive steps to end what would have been an extremely depressing hour and a half for everybody listening in and for this panel, but for the positivity and the collective effort of everybody on this panel who is contributing so much to the advancement of human rights work and civil liberties in their own regions and countries. Thank you, the audience. I know we've run over time today, and thank you for staying with us and for taking up so much of your afternoon, morning or evening, wherever you are in the world. There has been a lot of messages to us saying that people are interested in another event along the lines that Sarah has suggested, and so BHRC will definitely consider that. In the meantime, those of you who are barristers in England and Wales, or legal academics, or students in England and Wales, law students in England and Wales, please do join BHRC. We need your support to be able to put on these kind of events and to keep the dialogue going between our colleagues and friends in other places. And for everybody else, I just want to say thank you very much for your time and attention. I know the panelists really, really have, I think the audience has really valued hearing from these panelists. And I look forward to working together in what is a bleak landscape for human rights in this region, to try to look for ways to overcome and to step forwards. Thank you all very much for joining us, and with a huge note of appreciation for my panelists today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.